Congratulations on making it to the final installment of Paper 2 Resources. I really do hope that these things have proved to be helpful as far as breaking down the material. I always say that, reading Frederick Douglass takes a lot longer, but you probably have a little bit better understanding, or you've at least heard of slavery before. Sam Patch is much, much shorter, but my guess is most of you don't really have too much of a background on the Industrial Revolution of the early 19th century. In any case, it's always good to make it to another milestone, which is what we're going to do here today. We have talked about a lot of themes, issues, and concepts in Sam Patch. The development of not only celebridom, but also what industry is posing with respect to average Americans like Sam Patch. It's granting people that own the factories a lot of control, not only over the jobs that they're doing inside the factory, but also in their private lives. And we've seen how this is connecting to our class, both with respect to people like Harriet Martineau and Seth Luther, these working class activists, but also Jacksonian democracy. And that's where I want to begin our conversation here again today. Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian democracy, we've talked about how he meant different things in his presidency, meant different things to different people, and we're going to push that envelope a little bit further here today. But for the time being, I want to talk a bit about Sam Patch's legacy. And for that, I want you to get your Sam Patch book, open it up to, it's the final chapter entitled Celebrity, but go to page 164. 164. About 3 lines down from the top, there's a paragraph that starts out Sam Patch won. Okay, Sam Patch won a new kind of fame. He was born into obscurity and he did nothing that classists considered worthy of renown. Yet he wanted to be famous and he succeeded. He made a name that everyone knew, deeds that everyone had heard of, virtues and peculiarities that were the stuff of boyhood fantasies and barroom jokes. There were other similar new celebrities in the 1820s. Sam shared the spotlight with the half mythical Western heroes Mike Fink and Davy Crockett, and with the actor Edwin Forrest, who was emerging as the workingman's tragedian. Even the comedic Philadelphian Colonel Pluck competed for attention. So, a couple things are coming into focus. One, modern day celebrity, for good, better, or worse, that's coming into focus. And two, you're getting these I don't have a great way to put this. Maybe like unsung heroes, people that weren't professional, people that didn't go to the greatest and the most elite, most exclusive schools, but they made it. However you're wanting to define making it, they made it. People like Davy Crockett. That's who Sam Patch is sharing company with. I want you to go down to that next paragraph there. I'm still on 164. Americans who read the newspapers. Okay, toward the bottom. Americans who read the newspapers in the late 1820s, whether they liked what they read or not, learned that anyone could be famous. Democracy, commerce, and new kinds of popular imagination were rising all at once. Cut loose from their past and picking their way through uncharted territory, Americans crafted themselves as their ancestors had crafted chairs and farm fields. Celebrities played a part in that. They dramatized the possibilities of individual self making in the 19th century. At the same time, celebrities were commodified individuals, imagined and sold by a new apparatus of publicity, newspapers, popular theater, democratic literature that shaped stories for an emerging mass audience. The Sam Patch who reached the public was seldom, to borrow Sam's phrase, the real Sam Patch. The celebrity Sam Patch existed first in newspapers that gave few details about him, then in talk about those stories, then in the work of actors, poets, preachers, newsmen, and writers who had their own uses for Sam Patch, then in talk about all of that. If you read that last line of that paragraph, celebrity is one of the materials from which people in democratic capitalist America make their folklore and themselves. Further on down in that paragraph, there's a very important part in that page there, 165. Sam's posthumous, meaning after death. Sam's posthumous notoriety was strongest in the 1830s and 1840s when living memory of his leaps was fresh. These were also the years of Jacksonian democracy and the invention of the two party politics that, along with celebrity and the newspapers and much more, marked the rise of mass democratic public in the United States. In class, I always like to ask students, and even these video lectures, I kind of put this out there. What is it that politicians do? And what inevitably comes up in class is they try to paint themselves as exactly the same way that you are. What I think is going on here, and I think what this author is trying to tell us, is the 1820s and especially the 1830s are a very critical time period in the history of American politics. It's not just about the rise of Democrats and later on Whigs, it's also the transitioning to a form of American politics that you and I would recognize. And there's something very honorable in a guy like Sam Patch. Yeah, he's rough around the edges, and no, he's not an expert, not in a traditional sense that you would label him an expert. But there's something very honorable, something you might even say is American about all of that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Flip down, scroll down, whatever, to page 177. Now, this is going to be a little bit more difficult to find. I'm going to help you with that over my head there. But for the time being, I'm on page 177, somewhere in the middle. It's a part of that paragraph that starts out says somewhere between Buffalo and London. You can put me on pause if you need to, but that's where I am. Somewhere 177, somewhere between Buffalo and London, it seems, the Yankee Sam Patch merge with the Western frontiersmen to form an all American democratic hero, steadfastly brave and capable of great mayhem, crudely funny, governed by a born Democrat's transcendent knowledge of right and wrong, and prone to begin his sentences with, well, I reckon. Um, doesn't exactly scream expert, doesn't exactly scream philosopher, doesn't exactly scream elite. And I would argue it's by design, and I also argue that politicians are going to take note of this and they're going to follow his lead. Was Sam rough around the edges? Absolutely, right? Could he be a little bit on the crude side, even to a dangerous point? Absolutely. I mean, the guy is literally called Sam Patch, the famous jumper, because he jumps off of waterfalls. So yes, he can really go in a dangerous direction. But as we're finding out, Americans find that to be very endearing. They see a lot of themselves in Sam Patch. I think Sam Patch would have saw a lot of himself in Andrew Jackson. I want to I want to kind of put that on ice for just a second. We will come back to that. So just put that aside for just a second. I remember very vividly the election of 2004, and that was the year that George W. Bush was running for re-election, and he was running against a guy from Massachusetts, senator, by the name of John Kerry. And up until that point, the Bush campaign had done a very effective job of painting John Kerry as this out of touch Northeasterner. He went to Harvard. He went sailing on the weekends. He didn't have anything in common, didn't know what it meant to be middle class, let alone working class. And this guy, you can't vote for him because he's not you. He's not like you, doesn't prioritize the same things that you do. Now, to be sure here, George W. Bush had that great West Texas accent. And, he'd do this all day long. And every once in a while, he'd even do a little bit of that, meaning those institutions of higher learning that are associated with those symbols, that's what he wanted you to think when you thought George W. Bush. But the fact of the matter was, whereas Kerry went to Harvard, George Bush went to Yale. Whereas Kerry came from an elite family, George W. Bush was the grandson of a senator, Prescott Bush. And his father, and I'm sure you know this, was George Herbert Walker Bush, who had been President of the United States. George W. Bush was not exactly your common man from the ranks of nowhere. Um, I don't know if you've ever seen a town hall debate, but it's supposed to be a lot more informal, a lot more sort of low key, down to earth, approachable, intimate, whatever you want to say. In any case, I remember this town hall debate, and I remember the commentator saying, whatever Missouri does, if it goes red, if it goes blue, that is going to determine the outcome of the presidential election. And as it turned out, this town hall debate was taking place in Missouri. And I couldn't begin to tell you what the question was. I don't remember what the question was, but whatever it was, it had something to do with Missouri. Okay. And John Kerry went first. And John Kerry, it was a very well thought out answer. And he started out Missouri this and Missouri that, Missourians, Missouri, Missouri, Missouri. If you happen to be from, a part of the country that's a little more remote, a little bit more what you might think of as rural, there might be another way that you pronounce the word Missouri. And so George W. Bush goes second, and the first words out of his mouth are, well, I think the people of Missouri. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that George Bush's pronunciation of Missouri as Missouri was the reason that he won the '04 election. I'm not going to say that, but it certainly didn't hurt anything. If you can speak the local dialect, if you sound like you fit in, it goes a long, long way with respect to, people trusting you, people believing you, people seeing themselves in you. And that is something that traces its roots back to the time period that we're talking about right here. Late 1820s, early 1830s, people have figured this out. When the government makes a decision, sometimes that hits you in your wallet. Sometimes there are economic, financial winners, and sometimes there are people that get left behind. And if you're a politician, you better learn how to speak the local language. Otherwise, you might not be trusted, and that might mean you might not win that election. In any case, you can see how this squares away with Sam Patch and how people thought of him as a rough around the edges, a little bit crude at time, but an honorable guy that started out his sentences not with $10 words that only lawyers or political scientists understand, right? But with simplistic vernacular like, well, I reckon, so on and so forth. One one more exclamation point. Okay, humor me. You'll like this because if you go to 181, there's a picture on 181. And that picture is captioned right next to it. That picture is captioned Andrew Jackson on Sam Patch by Ralph Earl. Now, at this point in the semester, if you've been keeping up with the video lectures, I've ran my mouth a lot about Andrew Jackson, and I've showed you several pictures of Andrew Jackson. At this point, you should know who Andrew Jackson is in that painting. And of course, I am not talking about the horse. Andrew Jackson is the man, which would make Sam Patch the horse. I need you to understand the magnitude of this. We're talking about the President of the United States, and not just any president, arguably the most consequential, important, central president of the United States that's not named Abraham Lincoln, that we're going to talk about this semester, naming his horse Sam Patch, had to leave an impression on Andrew Jackson, right? Horses are a big, big deal during the 19th century, really big deal, big industry, however you want to slice or dice this. So for a sitting president to name his horse Sam Patch must have meant a lot of things in a good way to a lot of different Americans. And a lot of those Americans, like Andrew Jackson, kind of look at the world through the lens of, there is something really honorable with being ordinary, really honorable, really American, you might even say, about being average. And that's something that very much dovetails with what we're talking about here in class, the rise of popular politics, and what we've been learning about in Sam Patch. In any case, one more connector for you, okay? And I hope it's been helpful. I hope that you're beginning to see ways that you can really interrogate, really address this central question. Also hope that these resources have been useful to you. That's what they're designed to do. And if you have any other questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Take care.